Millionaire woman marries homeless man on a dare. What he did that night left her in tears. The gleaming towers of Manhattan stretched endlessly into the night sky, their lights reflecting off the rain-slicked streets below. In the penthouse suite of the Meridian Hotel, where champagne flowed like water and laughter echoed through marble corridors, Victoria Sterling commanded attention without even trying. At 32, she had built a tech empire that made her one of the youngest billionaires in America. Her name synonymous with ruthless ambition and calculated risks. But tonight, surrounded by her circle of equally wealthy friends, Victoria found herself bored by the familiar rhythm of their conversations about stock portfolios and exclusive vacation destinations. The charity gala they had just attended was supposed to be about helping the homeless, yet none of them seemed to truly understand what homelessness meant beyond writing checks and posing for photographs. It was Madison Crawford, her college roommate, and now a prominent socialite, who first planted the seed of what would become the most impulsive decision of Victoria's life. The group had been discussing the homeless man they'd seen outside the hotel. Earlier, a quiet figure who sat with remarkable dignity despite his circumstances, holding a simple cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps." God bless what started as idle conversation quickly escalated into something far more dangerous. The alcohol had loosened tongues and lowered inhibitions, and soon Victoria found herself defending her belief that she could understand anyone, connect with anyone, regardless of their social status. Her friends laughed, dismissing her claims as the naive romanticism of someone who had never truly struggled. The dare emerged from this heated discussion like a storm brewing on a clear day. Madison, her eyes glittering with champagne and mischief, challenged Victoria to prove her point in the most dramatic way possible. Marry the homeless man they'd seen outside. Not just talk to him, not just help him, marry him. The terms were simple yet shocking. Victoria would have to go through with a legal marriage ceremony, spend one night as his wife, and then she could annul it the next day if she chose. The room fell silent as the magnitude of the challenge sank in. For a moment, Victoria hesitated. She had built her fortune on calculated risks, but this was different. This was her life, her reputation, her very sense of self on the line. Yet something in her friends' expectant faces, something in their assumption that she would never follow through, ignited a familiar fire in her chest, the same determination that had driven her to build her empire from nothing. The stakes were raised to make the dare irresistible. If Victoria went through with it, Madison would donate $10 million to the homeless shelter of Victoria's choice. If she backed down, Victoria would have to donate the same amount and publicly admit that her claims about understanding and connecting with people were nothing more than privileged delusions. Victoria's mind raced as she considered the implications. $10 million could change countless lives. The homeless man outside seemed harmless enough, quiet, respectful, not aggressive like some of the others they'd encountered. And it would only be for one night. One night to prove a point, win a substantial donation for charity, and perhaps learn something about herself in the process. Before she could second-guess herself, Victoria found herself agreeing to the dare. The group erupted in shocked laughter and excited chatter. But Victoria was already moving, her mind shifting into the strategic mode that had made her successful in business. She would need to find the man, convince him to participate, arrange for a quick ceremony. Las Vegas was only a few hours away by private jet. As Victoria made her way down to the street, her designer heels clicking against the wet pavement, she spotted him exactly where they'd seen him before. Under the harsh glow of a streetlight, she could see him more clearly now. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with kind eyes and a face that spoke of intelligence despite his circumstances. His clothes were worn but clean, and he sat with a book in his lap, something she hadn't noticed from the penthouse window. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Victoria had expected. The man, who introduced himself simply as David, listened to her outrageous proposal with neither shock nor greed. but with a thoughtful consideration that caught her off guard. He asked her why she was doing this, what she hoped to gain, and whether she had truly considered the implications of her actions. Victoria found herself being more honest than she had intended. She told him about the dare, about the charity donation, about her desire to prove something to herself and others. David listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that made her examine her own motivations more deeply than she was comfortable with. What surprised Victoria most was David's initial reluctance. He wasn't jumping at the opportunity for what he surely saw as a temporary escape from his situation. Instead, he seemed genuinely concerned about her welfare, about whether she was making this decision for the right reasons. This unexpected consideration from someone who had every reason to be self-interested left Victoria feeling strangely moved. Eventually, after what felt like hours of conversation on that rain-soaked street corner, David agreed to her proposal. But he had conditions of his own. He wanted to know that if they went through with this, Victoria would treat the marriage, however temporary, with respect. He wasn't interested in being part of a cruel joke or a social media spectacle. If they were going to do this, they would do it with dignity. The flight to Las Vegas passed in a blur of surreal conversations and growing nervousness. Victoria had arranged everything with the efficiency that had made her business empire possible. Jet, the chapel, the paperwork. But as the Nevada lights grew brighter below them, she found herself studying David's profile in the cabin's soft lighting and wondering what she had gotten herself into. David had cleaned up in the hotel's bathroom, and while his clothes were still humble, there was something about him that commanded respect. He read during the flight a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations and occasionally made observations about the landscape below that revealed an education and intelligence that didn't match his circumstances. The wedding ceremony itself was brief and surreal. In a small chapel decorated with plastic flowers and neon lights, Victoria Sterling, who had graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune magazines, exchanged vows with a man whose last name she had learned only hours before. David Martinez spoke his vows with a sincerity that made Victoria's rehearsed words feel hollow by comparison. As they signed the marriage certificate, Victoria caught sight of their reflection in the chapel's mirror. They looked like characters from different stories who had somehow found themselves in the same scene. Yet there was something in David's eyes when he looked at her, not gratitude or opportunism, but something deeper that made Victoria's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. The hotel suite Victoria had booked was luxurious even by her standards, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the strip and amenities that cost more per night than most people made in a month. David stood at the window, looking out at the city lights, and Victoria realized that she had no idea what came next. The dare had been to marry him and spend one night as his wife, but no one had specified what that actually meant. As Victoria watched David's reflection in the window, she found herself noticing details she had missed before. The way he held himself with quiet dignity despite his circumstances. The careful way he moved through the luxurious space, touching nothing unnecessarily, but showing no signs of being overwhelmed or intimidated. There was a story here, she realized. Layers of complexity that her initial assumptions hadn't accounted for. The first chapter of their unlikely union was coming to a close, but Victoria sensed that the real story was just beginning. Whatever she had expected from this impulsive dare, David Martinez was proving to be nothing like her preconceptions. And as she prepared for what would undoubtedly be the most unusual night of her life, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to discover something that would change everything. The hotel suite felt different once they were alone. Victoria had expected awkwardness, perhaps some discussion about sleeping arrangements or boundaries. Instead, David had quietly asked if she minded if he showered, and when she nodded, he had disappeared into the bathroom with the same respectful distance he had maintained throughout their surreal day. Victoria used the time to call her, assistant and handle some urgent business emails, falling back into the familiar rhythm of work to calm her nerves. But her concentration kept breaking as she heard the shower running and found herself wondering about the man she had just married. Who was David Martinez? How had he ended up on the streets? And why did he seem so at peace with circumstances that would have broken most people? When David emerged from the bathroom, Victoria barely recognized him. Clean-shaven and dressed in the hotel's complimentary robe, he looked like a completely different person. His features were sharp and intelligent, his posture straight and confident. But it was his eyes that caught Victoria's attention. They held a depth of knowledge and experience that spoke of a life far more complex than she had imagined. What happened next would remain etched in Victoria's memory for the rest of her life. David didn't ask for anything, not money, not favors, not even basic necessities. Instead, he sat at the suite's desk and began to write. Not on hotel stationery, but in a worn notebook that he had pulled from his jacket pocket. The same jacket he had been wearing on the street, now cleaned and pressed by the hotel's laundry. Service, curiosity getting the better of her, Victoria asked what he was writing. David looked up from his notebook, and for the first time since they had met, she saw vulnerability in his expression. He explained that he wrote letters to his daughter, who lived across the country with her mother. Letters that he could never send because he had no address to put as a return location. The story that unfolded over the next hour shattered every assumption Victoria had made about David and about homelessness itself. David Martinez had been a professor of literature at a prestigious university, a published author with a PhD from Columbia. He had been married to a woman he loved deeply, and they had a daughter who was now 8 years old, a little girl who thought her father was dead. The tragedy that had destroyed David's life was both common and devastating. A severe car accident had left him with chronic pain and addiction to prescription medication that his doctors had initially prescribed for his injuries. When the legitimate prescriptions ran out, David had turned to illegal alternatives, beginning a downward spiral that had cost him his job, his marriage, and his home. His wife, Sarah, had tried to help him, but David's addiction had made him unpredictable and sometimes dangerous. The final break had come when David, in the grip of withdrawal, had become violent during an argument. He had never hit Sarah or their daughter, but the threat had been there, and Sarah had made the impossible decision to leave him and start over somewhere else. To protect their daughter from the shame and confusion of having an addicted father. Sarah had told their child that David had died in the accident. It was easier, she had reasoned, than explaining addiction to a young mind or subjecting their daughter to the uncertainty of a father who might disappear at any moment. David had been sober for over a year now, but the damage to his life had been complete. Without references, without a permanent address, without any way to prove his recovery, he had been unable to find work in his field. The few jobs he could get didn't pay enough for rent in any city where he might hope to rebuild his academic career. And so he had ended up on the streets, invisible to the world that had once respected and valued him. As David shared his story, Victoria found herself confronting the comfortable assumptions she had made about homelessness, about addiction, about the people she had dismissed as having made bad choices. Here was a man who had built a successful life, who had loved and been loved, who had contributed to society in meaningful ways. And yet a combination of circumstances, some within his control, others not, had led him to the street corner where she had found him. But it was what David did next that brought Victoria to tears. From his notebook, he pulled out a small photograph, worn and creased from handling, but clearly treasured. It was a picture of a little girl with dark hair and bright eyes, laughing as she rode on David's shoulders. The resemblance between father and daughter was unmistakable, and the love in David's expression was heartbreaking in its intensity. David explained that he wrote to his daughter every day, pouring out his love, his regrets, and his hopes for the future in the letters that would never be sent. He told her about the books he was reading, the people he met, the small kindnesses that kept him going. He shared his memories of their time together and his dreams of someday, being worthy of being her father again. Victoria watched as David wrote that night's letter, his handwriting careful and precise despite the emotion in his words. He wrote about the strange day he had experienced, about the unexpected kindness of a stranger, about the reminder that sometimes life presents opportunities for grace and redemption in the most unlikely circumstances. But it was David's closing words that broke Victoria's heart completely. He wrote to his daughter about love, not romantic love, but the deeper kind of love that exists between souls who recognize something true in each other. He wrote about how her mother had been right to protect her from his failures, but how he hoped that someday, when she was older, she might understand that people are complex, that mistakes don't define a person's worth, and that love can survive even the worst circumstances. As Victoria read over David's shoulder, tears streaming down her face, she realized that she had entered this marriage as a game, a dare, a way to prove a point. But David had approached it with the same dignity and respect that he seemed to bring to everything in his life. He had honored their vows, temporary as they might be, by sharing his most precious possessions with her, his story, his pain, his love for his daughter. The night passed quietly after that. David slept on the couch, insisting that Victoria take the bed, and Victoria lay awake staring at the ceiling, processing everything she had learned. She thought about her own relationship with her parents, about the assumptions she had made about people based on their circumstances, about the comfortable bubble of privilege that had protected her from understanding real struggle. When morning came, Victoria made a decision that would change both of their lives. She couldn't undo David's past or instantly solve his problems, but she could offer him something no one else had been able to give him in over a year: a chance to rebuild his life with dignity. Victoria offered David a job, not as charity, but as a recognition of his talents and intelligence. Her company needed someone to head up their new literacy initiative, someone who understood both the power of words and the reality of struggle. It would mean starting over, proving himself again, but it would also mean having an address, a salary, and perhaps eventually, the stability to reconnect with his daughter. David's response was characteristic of everything Victoria had learned about him. He didn't accept immediately, didn't fall over himself with gratitude. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions about the position, about Victoria's expectations, about whether she was offering this opportunity because of their unusual circumstances, or because she genuinely believed he could contribute something valuable. As they sat in the hotel restaurant, sharing breakfast and discussing the possibilities ahead, Victoria reflected on how much had changed in less than 24 hours. She had begun this journey thinking she was doing someone else a favor, proving a point about her own character and understanding. Instead, she had discovered that she was the one who needed to learn, to grow, to understand the complex realities of life beyond her privileged bubble. The marriage would be annulled, as planned, but the connection between Victoria and David would prove to be lasting. Not romantic love, but something deeper, a mutual respect and understanding that had grown from honesty, vulnerability, and the recognition that every person carries within them stories of both triumph and struggle. As Victoria arranged for David's transportation back to New York and his transition into his new role, she found herself thinking about the letter he had written to his daughter the night before. She thought about second chances, about the possibility of redemption, and about the courage it takes to keep loving, even when that love seems impossible to express. The dare had been won. The $10 million would go to charity, and Victoria would return to her friends with a story that would become legend in their social circle. But the real victory was smaller and more personal. The understanding that had passed between two people who had found themselves unexpectedly connected by circumstances that had seemed random but had proved to be transformative. David Martinez would spend the next several months rebuilding his life, proving his worth in his new position, and slowly, carefully, beginning the process of reaching out to his daughter. And Victoria Sterling would carry with her the memory of a night when she had learned that sometimes the most profound changes in our lives come not from the grand gestures we plan, but from the small acts of courage we stumble into when we least expect them. The story of their unusual marriage would become a reminder that human connection trans circumstances, that dignity exists independent of material wealth, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give another person is simply the opportunity to be seen and valued for who they truly are.
Thank you for watching this story unfold with us here on M&A The Story Unfolds. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of the world you're joining us from. Your support means everything. See you in the next story.